Hello and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Centre video podcast. Today our guest is Christopher Garrett, who is an explosive ordnance disposal technician and a chairman at a non-profit corporation PREVAIL, which deals with EOD, trauma medicine and humanitarian support. Welcome, Christopher.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Christopher, you work extensively with Ukraine and with demining in Ukraine. What is your daily experience? This land has been reported as the most infested with landmines region in the world. How bad is the situation on the ground?
So yeah, you're correct on that. At the moment, they do class Ukraine as the most heavily contaminated. To put that into numbers, I believe previously Myanmar was the most heavily contaminated, which was estimated to be somewhere between 5 to 6 million landmines. So I think it's safe to say that Ukraine's looking at an issue that it's at least 6 million landmines that they're having to deal with on the ground there. And the landmines are only one part of the explosive threat. You still have abandoned ordnance, you have IEDs, you have unexploded ordnance from the fighting as well. So the situation on the ground is very critical at the moment. The contamination is stopping a lot of people being able to access their land, even in areas that the fighting has subsided.
When you work on the field and you go like on a certain day, maybe every day, to demining mission, what does it look like? Like you wake up, you take a coffee, you have a breakfast, then you have a briefing. What do you discuss? Like how is it got planned, assigned, or what threats are being discussed? Like how does it look like?
So it depends who I'm working with at the time. Obviously, because in the past I've done a lot of work with the Ukrainian military, so those operations are very different. I won't go into them. But when we support the national police, generally it's wake up in the morning, cigarette, coffee, drive to the office. We'll then receive a briefing on where we're going to go, and we'll move out to those areas. And they might be new areas where the police haven't actually been in before, or no other state actors have been in to do any clearance, or it might be an area that we've been working in the past. It could be looking for landmines. Other times it could be going in to remove abandoned ammunition stockpiles that were left over either by the Ukrainians or the Russian forces in fighting areas. It could be going and searching old trenches or villages that were impacted by the fighting. Sometimes, depending on the areas, if there's mines in those areas or booby-traps, we might destroy them in place where they are if they can't be rendered safe. Otherwise, everything will be picked up and then taken to a disposal area and destroyed there. But every day is different. So I would say that the clearance that we do with the police, it's not military clearance. You know, we are going in to specifically clear all that area if we can. Whereas opposed to with the military, we're clearing specific areas to be able to help push military operations, and we're not clearing to what would be deemed as the international humanitarian standard either, because we don't have the time to do it. For the Ukrainian police bomb disposal department, they have 375 EOD techs for the entire country. So obviously they are split across the entire country. You have people that are taking a rotation to take a break, then you have people that are actively working, and then you have other people that are taking higher training or have time off. So it's not big numbers for a very, very big country to deal.
You have written recently that winter makes all things worse. What did you mean by that?
So obviously trying to find landmines when they're buried in the ground or when they're under leaf matter and rubbish is quite hard in itself at times. But once you have snow coverage and you have frost on the ground and the ground becomes frozen, it's almost impossible to be able to find the mines properly. You're dealing with very cold weather. That weather affects your critical thinking. It makes your hands cold. You know yourself. If you spend too long somewhere and get too cold, the only thing you think about is wanting to go home, wanting to get warm, which is fine if you're out walking the dog, but if you're looking for something that can kill you, it's quite dangerous. So even in places where you might be able to find a landmine where it's buried, because the ground freezes so hard, the landmine becomes stuck in the ground, which makes it then very dangerous to try to remove that.
When we talk about the situation in Ukraine, we know there is over 1,000 kilometers of front line with active fighting. There is also 1,000 kilometers or more of a border to Ukraine and Belarus, where is no active land fighting, but still the danger is present. And we have a huge territory of Ukraine which has been liberated by the Ukrainian army, but where is like mine hazard is present. And all three regions are quite different. What organizations are working there, and what challenges do they face?
With the situation on the ground, when we're looking at clearance levels, there's a few different types of demining that obviously go on. You have the military demining, you have the demining from the police and state emergency services, and then you have the humanitarian mine action organizations. So out of those, the humanitarian mine action organizations type of clearance is the most thorough. So when you're looking at humanitarian demining, as they are clearing an area through hand clearance methods, you're not just removing the landmines or unexploded ordnance, you're removing any scrap metal that's in the ground, any other contaminants that are in the ground. But it's a very, very slow type of clearance. It's the type of clearance that's needed to be able to say that somewhere is 100% clear. But you are only maybe clearing roughly on average about 10 square meters a day. When we look at the fact that Ukraine has roughly 170,000 square kilometers of contaminated land, you can see the size of the problem that is kind of faced there. There is areas where they're going to be able to run mechanical machines over. There's areas that they're going to be able to clear quicker. And not all of those 170,000 kilometers is completely riddled with landmines, but the threat of either landmines or unexploded ordnance, explosive remnants of war is there. So the clearance will outlive my life. It will probably outlive my family's life. It's going to go on for years. So this misconception that Ukraine will be able to clear its land in 10 to 20 years, it's just not correct, and it's not helping anyone by saying it. It's leading a false sense of security.
We are now currently talking with Christopher Garrett, who is an explosive ordnance disposal technician and a chairman at non-profit corporation PREVAIL, who deals with landmines in Ukraine. So, Christopher, if we can talk about these different aspects of dealing with landmines and with unexploded ordnances, you have already mentioned the army part and the civilian part. The army needs, obviously, demining in order to continue with the offensive operation. And what are the problems here? Like, how can you describe the scale of the challenge which the Ukrainian soldiers face during this offensive?
So it's a very complex situation. What's happened is, effectively since the conflict first broke out, which was in 2014, landmines have been getting used by both sides in the conflict to toughen up their defences. Then fast track to Russia's invasion in 2022. Obviously Russia invaded. The Russians brought in a lot of landmines with them and then started mining extensively areas once the Ukrainians started to counterattack. The Ukrainians themselves have then been putting in their own minefields, obviously to slow down the Russian advance. And to add to the problem, we've then had Western countries delivering landmines and cluster munitions to the country as well. So, we have to be realistic about it and say that both sides have used landmines, both sides have used cluster munitions. But what this has unfortunately done is it's created a mine belt which effectively runs from the entire front line, from top to bottom of Ukraine. And that's just where the current static line is at the moment. If you look at any of the areas where Russia pushed through all the way up to the outskirts of Kiev, there was landmines used all the way to the edge of Kiev by the Russian forces. So it is a really complex situation, and what's happened now, because the front line has gone quite static, there's been heavy mining by both sides. So for either side to try and make a push, they are having to deal with not just the enemy's landmines, they're having to deal with their own landmines as well. They're having to deal with what I would class as lost mines, which are mines that are placed and have been forgotten about now because the front line has obviously moved from left to right. And it's almost impossible for either side to make a concerted effort to push through these defences. There's no proper marking or mapping of these mines. It's very complex to try and explain. So if you imagine during the Second World War, countries would put in mine belts as defences, so they would know exactly where these mine belts were. They would be marked. They would normally be boxed off with like barbed wire and signs. They would know how many there was. This is a defensive role by a country to protect itself. But because on the front line in Ukraine, you have this constant shifting of the front line. It might only be by a couple of 100 meters, east or west, whichever direction it's going. But it means that this minefield is then moving. The minefield stays, but on a map of fighting, it's effectively, you might have that minefield in front of you, and then the next day that minefield is behind you, or you're in that minefield. And it's this constant push to and fro that they're having to deal with.
That we're talking about this front line, which is over 1,000 kilometers length. Is it a constant, continuous landmine belt?
Pretty much. You know, that's a very complicated one. That's a very complicated one to try and explain, really. So it's not like you have a continuous minefield top to bottom that have been hand laid, but in a lot of the active fighting areas, you will have small amounts of landmines in one place, small amounts of landmines in another place. Then you will have areas that have been hit with cluster munitions, so anti-personnel and anti-tank landmines from rocket cassettes. So the threat is the entire length of that front line, really. The problem is the saturation of mines differs from place to place. So if we look at places like outside of Avdiivka, outside of Bakhmut and Soledar, where there was heavy fighting towards the end of last year and the start of this year, there was big, extensive mine belts put in by both sides as part of the defences.
When we're talking about the saturation by the landmines and UXAs, what is the an average saturation? Like when we talk about like 1 square meter, 100 square meters, what kind of landmines are there, and how much of efforts does it take to remove them?
It really varies depending on the area. So in some places on the front line, you could maybe only have 20 or 30 anti-tank mines in a kilometer, in a square kilometer. But in other places, you could have 1,000 in a square kilometer. There was some Russian mine maps that were found in, I think it was August this year, and they were the first produced mine maps that we'd actually seen from the Russian sides that had been captured. And one of these covered maybe a maximum of 10 square kilometer area of the front line. I won't say which part. But of just one type of anti-tank mine alone, there was over 18,600 in this area, and that was just one type of mine of, I think, 16 or 17 different munitions that were labelled onto that. So in some places it's a huge problem. I mean, with anti-personnel mines, with PMM1 and PMM2, PMM4, there's been pitches where the saturation has almost been 3 to 5 mines per square meter.
That are
normally this is crazy.
That are insane numbers. Absolutely. Like, how can you deal with that? And what I heard from like other experts is that the Russians use a combination of landmines, having anti-tank landmine, put together with anti-personnel mines to make the demining more complicated. How can a soldier, a mine expert, go into this area knowing that they need to deal with dozens of landmines in a very small part, and they're all being put the way to make the demining almost impossible?
Yeah. I mean, for your average soldier, they do not have any demining experience. They won't have the access to the equipment that they need to do it. And it creates a very dangerous situation for them, because there is not enough combat engineers within the Ukrainian armed forces to take on the role to be able to actively clear as fast as they need to. Lots of soldiers are losing legs. The Ukrainians, they don't like to talk about their casualty numbers anyway, but a lot of the time, even if they did, they would only be talking about the soldiers that were killed. They're not talking about the soldiers that were injured from landmines. One of the units that I worked with very extensively at the end of last year, as an average just for their unit alone, they were taking 4 to 5 landmine casualties every day, just in one area, and that was from PFM butterfly mines. I mean, certainly in areas in Crimea, we did a lot of work in Crimea towards the end of last year and the start of this year, and the forest there is just completely littered with landmines. But you're forced into those minefields, because working in the forested areas there, when you are driving or walking down the tracks, there's no tree cover, because obviously you're on the track, which means you're then targeted by drones, you're targeted by artillery, you're targeted by mortars, by tanks. So that pushes you to then move into the forest. But then as soon as you're in the forest, you're having to deal with the landmine threat. And every day that we were working there, there would be tens of cluster munitions fired over those areas, and they are scattering thousands of landmines.
That makes the situation what you described like almost impossible to deal with. How is it realistic to clear these minefields with standard means, or we have seen that the Ukrainians tried to use these UR-77 demining charges when rocket artillery fires a lone charge, and it makes the mines detonate, or at least it is how it is intended to work. Is this tactic realistic, or is it just like a chance of like several percent of landmines being destroyed that way?
Okay, so the UR-77, it's a combat demining machine. So effectively, these are designed for if you are trying to breach through a minefield to make an assault on enemy positions, or to breach a minefield to be able to get access to a new area. That's all this is used for, and they're literally designed for just putting out that MICLIC, that mine clearance line charge. And as you say, it will either detonate, or it will at least disrupt or push aside mines that are on the surface. But they only serve a specific purpose. It is literally just to get troop movement from point A to point B. When it comes to actual clearance of mines properly, the bulk of this needs to be done by hand. The West has sent numerous demining machines, like demining tractors, to Ukraine, but these can only work in very specific areas. The ground needs to be relatively flat. There can't be any trees in the way. You can't use these vehicles driving down a street in Bakhmut or Bucha or somewhere like this. So the bulk of the mine clearance will still have to be done by hand. There's no way around that. Especially, you will have seen the pictures of specific areas on the front line in the fields where the fighting has been intense for over a year now, and you have these almost moonscape pictures of these fields with these huge craters in. You can't run a mine clearance tractor across these. Oh. So places like this, again, it's all going to have to be manually demined.
But that means that there are thousands of square kilometers of Ukraine which will remain no-go areas for years, if not decades.
Yeah.
can any international experience help here, or does the international experience say, okay, just mark these forests as forests where you don't go and forget them?
I think what we will see is very similar to what was done in France after the First and Second World War, where the areas that need to be cleared to obviously regain access to infrastructure, power and water, critical infrastructure areas and critical, say, agricultural areas and civilian populations. Those will be the first areas that will get cleared. After this, they will just have to put pen to paper and work out exactly how they're going to make a start on this, because some of the areas, especially in places like Bakhmut, where the fighting was so intense, and places like Avdiivka right now, the fighting has been so intense. If you imagine you have flat land where the Ukrainians or the Russians have dug trenches, they then placed in landmines as defenses. But then you've had heavy fighting, you've had heavy artillery, the ground gets thrown up, some of these items get buried, then more fighting happens, some of these items get buried again, then more landmines get placed on top, you have unexploded rockets, you have unexploded artillery, you have dead soldiers that are wearing equipment with hand grenades or explosives on their body or rocket propelled grenades. These are all explosive hazards that are going to take time to obviously sift through and deal with. It's going to take a very long time. I think there's a common misconception in some areas that Ukraine will be able to speed up the mine clearance by bringing in a lot of technology and recreating the wheel overnight, and I applaud them for their efforts, but I think that there's a misconception that technology will be able to rid this problem in 10 to 20 years.
Well, that is a very dramatic perspective, and a lot of efforts will be needed.
It's sobering. It is very sobering, but that's how it will be. Ukraine is still fighting. If we look at places like Afghanistan, or if we look at places like Cambodia, they are still clearing landmines. France, they are still clearing landmines and unexploded bombs from World War One.
Indeed, we even have in Germany, in several cities, we have special departments which are dealing exclusively with looking for unexploded free-fall bombs from World War II, and they still find those which are still intact and can pose a danger. We're talking to Christopher Garrett, who is an explosive ordnance disposal technician and a chairman of a non-profit corporation, PREVAIL, dealing with landmines problem in Ukraine. Don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel, write your comments under this video, and we're discussing further the situation with landmines and unexploded ordnances in Ukraine. Christopher, you have already mentioned the problem which the civilian population faces in the liberated areas. People cannot come back to their homes, people cannot use the agricultural land. What level of mine threat are the civilians facing in Ukraine currently?
The level is unprecedented in my personal opinion, because of the way of life in Ukraine. So most families, even if they live in larger cities, Lviv, Kiev, Odessa, places like this, most families will still have a summer home that they will go to. These summer homes are normally a parcel of land with a small building where they grow crops. They will then store these crops down for the winter and use these crops themselves. That's a knock-on effect from Ukraine's time as part of the Soviet Union, where you had to grow food. A lot of these areas people just cannot go to. And then if we look at the more bigger agricultural farming, the impact is massive, because people need to earn a living. If you're growing crop on a field, and then you have to leave that field alone for a couple of years because there's landmines or unexploded ordnance, it's very expensive for them to A, take that loss of the initial crop, but B, if the ground is not turned over properly, it becomes harder and harder for them to do it. There's huge areas where people just can't get back to their homes, and even if the fighting stopped, if they still had a home to go back to and it's not being destroyed by the fighting, these areas are littered with explosive ordnance. They're littered with landmines. They're littered with booby traps.
How extensive do the Russians use booby-traps when they leave the regions?
It's quite extensive. So early on, after the Russians were kicked out of the Kiev region, places like Hostomel, Bucha, and Irpin saw extensive booby-trapping of children's toys, booby-trapping of civilian everyday items, washing machines, fridges, cupboards in the kitchen. There was a case of a body that was booby-trapped and put into the back of a car, into the boot of a car. There was booby traps and hand grenades left under civilian bodies in the street. And then if we fast forward to the liberation of Kherson, when the Russians pulled out of Kherson, the booby trapping there was incredibly bad. In some places it was so bad that the authorities deemed it safer to just destroy the buildings as opposed to try to clear them.
If we're talking about, let me say, Kherson, an intensively populated city where hundreds of thousands of people live now, what is the typical portrait of a person which is most endangered by a mine threat?
Low income, I would say. People that have to rely on subsistence farming. People that rely on going to the forests for seasonal mushrooms or for hunting. These are the people that are the biggest at threat. People that are living in rural communities where they're reliant on having small amounts of livestock themselves, whether it be pigs or goats or cows or whatever they have. These are the people that are most at threat, because to clear in an urban environment where the fighting has been heavy but not super extensive, to the point that everything is destroyed, it's much quicker to clear those areas within reason. And if there's areas that are bad, you can obviously just mark them off and try and make the rest of them safer. But once you're looking at urban, rural environments, and you're not dealing with concrete and roads anymore, you're dealing with grass, you're dealing with sand, you're dealing with soil and forest. It just takes a lot longer to clear. So if you're walking down a concrete road and you see 10 anti-tank mines, it's a relatively simple job to be able to remove them or destroy them, whichever the case may be. But if you have a dirt track running through a small village, it can take a lot longer to find those mines.
But that means that these landmines and the uxes and the booby traps, they can last for years, for decades. So
Yes.
as long as you don't actively demine the territory, it remains dangerous. So the danger doesn't go away. We're talking about millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars and thousands of hours of work to demine it. What kind of international experience, once again, like from Cambodia or from Afghanistan or from Iraq, can be used here, or can it?
I mean, the basis that international humanitarian mine clearance is built on, the frameworks that they've had in place for years, ever since kind of like the Baltics, when organizations like Halo first came around. They have a vast wealth of experience and knowledge in how to do this, working across multiple countries across the world. They have the experience. They know how to do this. They have the technical. But I think the situation in Ukraine is just going to be quite hard from a financial point of view alone, just getting the funding. I mean, we're talking billions. It's going to be billions of dollars to clear Ukraine. And then on the side, you get the question from other people going, well, we haven't finished clearing Cambodia yet. We need to finish that first. And personally, I think we need to concern ourselves with getting the civilian areas and the critical infrastructure areas cleaned as fast as possible. And in the case of Ukraine, because it's going to take so long to clear, as you said before, the government is just going to have to turn around and say, once the fighting's done, these areas are out of bounds. You know, there's places on the front line anyway. If we look at like Avdiivka or Pisky or places like this, the civilians aren't really going to move back in. There's nothing to move back into. It's a barren wasteland that's been destroyed. So at least with areas like this, they can be marked off, and hopefully people will not try to go back to whatever is left of their homes. And then the government and humanitarian agencies can deal with the critical areas first, and then move on from that.
Can Russia be brought to justice and be forced, like, to pay at least for demining activities? Is there any international experience saying that that's possible?
I honestly couldn't answer that. I would like to think that they would be forced to cover the clearance for the landmines. But to be honest, I'd like to see them have to cover for the extensive damage that they've done across the country, not just from mining. But that's above my pay grade.
What kind of help can be provided here? Like, I understand that one can donate for a demining organization, like Halatrust, your organization, PREVAIL, others, or you can donate, of course, for the Ukrainian official foundations. But what else can be done here?
I mean, what we try to do as an organization, and what I've tried to do ever since 2014 as myself, I try to reach out to people to get access to equipment, so demining equipment, landmine probes, landmine detectors, and obviously since last year to try to get help to fund our operations. None of us take a wage. We don't get paid for what we do, but we do need financial support to be able to buy fuel, to purchase vehicles, to upkeep those vehicles, and to be able to upkeep the equipment that we use. It's quite hard at the moment. I feel that, especially with everything going on in the Middle East right now as well, there's a lot of support being lost for Ukraine. Which is a shame. It's a real shame because, you know, even just basic equipment, like things like trying to buy mine probes, we now found a source of like bulk mine probes in the United States, and they cost about the same amount as a coffee. You know, for the price of a cup of coffee, someone could be repeatedly saving someone's life.
Well, that is a very dramatic perspective which you have described. We are entering the third year of this war, another winter, extensive use of all types of equipment, extensive losses, and still no end in sight. It was Christopher Garrett, who is an explosive ordnance disposal technician and the chairman of the non-profit corporation PREVAIL, which deals with EODs, trauma medicine, and humanitarian support, and is extensively dealing with Ukraine. Thank you, Christopher, for this moving interview.
Thank you very much for having me.
Don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel, wait for the new interviews, and stay tuned.